And now for part two. Those who cannot follow Christ.
What did Christianity cost Paul? Cost him his reputation among the Jews. It cost him a body that was bruised and beaten. It cost him imprisonment. It cost him being shipwrecked. It cost him everything. He gave up everything. In one other place he said, I gave up being married because I couldn't do what the Lord wanted me to do and have a wife. Boy, let's talk about that for a minute. Paul understood that as a husband, and perhaps a father someday, Paul understood as a husband that he had obligations to a wife. That's God's directive. But he had obligations to Christ to go preach to the Jews, to the Gentiles, to slaves, and to kings. Now, if he took that obligation to Christ seriously, he didn't have the time, the place to fulfill obligations to a wife. So he gave that up. Whose obligations came first? Christ. Now, folks, that's not a condemnation of marriage, because Paul encouraged marriage in several places in the New Testament. But Paul had a special obligation directly from Christ in Damascus. What did it cost him? It cost him everything. Now, we don't know how Paul died. We have tradition, and tradition was that they beheaded him. Paul gave up everything. He understood by living it, there's a cost to being a Christian. I want to make this a little more important to us this morning. I want to go over to Hebrews chapter 11. We do not know the author of the book of Hebrews for sure. Many suggest that it was the Apostle Paul himself, but we don't know that. But in the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews, many Bible teachers call it the Hebrew Hall of Faith chapter. It was written to Christians who were Jews, Jewish Christians, Hebrew Christians. And these Christians knew their history, okay? They knew about Moses, and they knew about Elijah and Joshua, and they knew about the prophets. They knew that. And in that 11th chapter, the writer starts out with the subject of faith. He said, I want you people to understand that there were some of your ancestors that had great faith. By the way, the same thing can be said of folks in this room. Some of us have had ancestors generations back who were great men and women of faith. But in this chapter particularly, we're not talking about Christians and faith. We're talking about Hebrews long before the coming of Christ who had faith. And he starts out very early in this list talking about the Old Testament man of faith, Abraham. And God tested Abraham's faith not one time, but many times. But the time that is most remembered by us in this room is when God said, Abraham, take Isaac and go up there, build a fire on an altar, kill him, and burn his body in sacrifice. Now, folks, that's just beyond our concept of God. God wouldn't do a thing like that. But God is revealing to us. Think about it. God's revealing to us to show us what kind of faith he had. And by the way, Isaac wasn't a 6-year-old little boy. Most scholars of the scripture think he was probably 18 or 19 years old. You fathers who have 18 or 19-year-old sons realize you can't do much with them unless they are agreeable, right? So they both had faith. And then it goes through that list. Now, I want you to look with me. We're going to start down here in verse 36. I could read all of it, but I don't take the time. I want you to listen carefully to what it cost these Hebrews in ancient history to be faithful to God. Listen to what it cost them. Well, I got to go back to verse 35. Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And now verse 36. And others had trial of cruel mockings. People laugh at you. That doesn't hurt on the outside. That hurts on the inside. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourging. Yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn asunder. And that means exactly what it says. Modern historians are still writing about men and women in the 1200s in Europe who were put to death by being cut in two with a saw. Were tempted, were slain with a sword. They wandered about in sheepskin and goat skins. History today tells us that in the ancient world, in early Christianity, many of the early Christians, because they refused to acknowledge Caesar as king, were refused the opportunity to work. And they were refused the opportunity to buy anything. They were reduced to abstract poverty. I'll get the word in a minute. That's what this is saying. They had nothing. Being destitute, afflicted, and tortured. Now, one more sentence. Verse 38. The writer of this wrote, and listen to these words. To me, they're the most important words in this entire chapter. Referring to these people of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts, in mountains, in caves, and dens of the earth. In the Old Testament, if you were going to be loyal to the God of heaven, there was a price. In the New Testament, under Christianity, Paul understood there was a price to being a Christian. We need to thank God at Perry Church that all of these terrible things that Paul experienced, and Paul's not just alone. Because we live where we do, we don't suffer those things. But there's still a price to pay for being a Christian. And we started out several minutes ago now talking about those that cannot be a disciple of Christ according to Christ himself. Those that put their family before him. Those that either refuse or neglect to fulfill their obligations to Christ. And then there are those that don't count the cost. And sooner or later, problems arise, money happens. Now, I want you to do one more thing. Maybe you can do it right now. But you got a bulletin today. There's a cartoon-like illustration on the back that closes what we've been talking about today. When there's a price. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. That's Jesus speaking. But he's not talking about rest on Saturday afternoon. He's talking about eternal rest. And when they speak about eternal punishment, one of the phrases that's used in Scripture is, they have no rest. So Christianity is serious business. But the end result is we'll have eternal rest. Take your hymn books and turn to Joe 360. Is that the right number? And we're going to offer the invitation of Christ. And you know, a lot of men and a lot of women bring children into the world and they don't appreciate the responsibility they have to that child. There are a lot of people that confess before congregations, I believe Jesus is the Son of God, and are baptized for the forgiveness of their sins. That's great. But that's the beginning. And too often, they respond like a young man I baptized at 11:30 one night. I talked to him a little bit before, and he called and said, I want to be baptized tonight. So since I'd already spoken to him about Christianity briefly, I baptized him, and no sooner than we got out of the baptistry, got dried off, he said, Preacher, I appreciate it, and you won't see me again. I've done it. I never saw him again. So, folks, I want this to be something for us to think about today. The invitation's yours. Will you please stand while we sing 360?